Greetings and welcome to BeIndie.biz. My name is Alan Thorn, and in this video tutorial series we're going to be seeing how to create an infinite runner game from start to end. I'm going to show you how to create this game every step of the way. It's a completely free course aimed at anybody who wants to learn how to make games using a professional workflow. I've been a game developer for 20 years and I've been teaching games for 4 years. I absolutely love the practice of game development and I want to share with you the process of how to make games. In this series we're going to see how to make an infinite runner. We're going to have a player character that can move left and right to avoid oncoming obstacles, and you need to see how long you can survive. We're going to be creating this game in the Unity engine. In this part specifically, we're going to look at how we can set up the player character. How can we import a character? How can we set up animations for the character, like an idle animation or a run animation? And we're going to be looking at how we can make that character move throughout the scene. This entire process looks at a range of critical concepts that we're going to need, and we're going to be using them all in the next movie when we're going to look at how we can actually make the infinite part of our infinite runner. Now there's a lot to get through in this video, so let's get started. In this section of the course, we're going to be focusing primarily on the player character, at least initially setting up the character and the character model. Now, our project right now, it really doesn't have a character model. It only has this corridor that stretches on for quite a few prefabs. We saw how to do that in the last movie. In this movie, we're going to get access to the player character. Once again, as we did with the environment, we're going to access or to resource our assets on the Unity Asset Store. We're going to get a completely free model that we can drag and drop into our project and use straight away. So to do that, I'm going to switch to the Unity Asset Store by going to the Asset Store tab here. Alternatively, if you don't see that tab, you can access that by choosing Window, Asset Store. The keyboard shortcut for that is Command 9 on a Mac or Control 9 on a Windows PC. You can see the shortcut listed here in the margin. I'm going to switch to the Asset Store tab, and Unity is going to go ahead and do its thing, which basically is making you wait. And finally, when the Asset Store loads, I'm going to move to the Search tab and I'm going to search for, well, let's take a look at what we can find. Character. I'm going to have a look for character and I'm going to switch this to free. And right at the top left-hand side, we have this Cyborg Character. I'm going to select the Cyborg Character brought to us by Hadron Studio here. And again, this is completely free, so you can download this from the Asset Store. Remember, for you, this button here may say download because you don't already have it on your computer. So you need to click download first. Once you've downloaded that project or that asset, you can then import it into your Unity project. I'm going to click the import button. And just in the same way with the environment assets that we imported earlier in the first movie, we have a similar thing here with the player character. We have a list of all the assets included in the player character package. In particular, we have a selection of animations that can be applied to the character model. We have some materials and we have the model itself. By default, I'm going to leave all of these different things here activated. If they're not already activated, you just have to move down here to the bottom left-hand side and choose all. And then when you're done doing that, you can move to the bottom right-hand side and choose the import button. So we're going to import those assets into the project. It may take a short time while Unity processes the assets, but just as with the environment assets, the character assets will be added down here to the project panel. You can already see beneath Barking Dog, the environment assets, we have Cyborg. I'm going to double click on the Cyborg folder and you can see the different folders and collections that we have associated with that asset. I'm going to move here to the Models folder and then simply select the Cyborg character. Here inside the Object Inspector in the Preview tab, you can see a preview of the character model and everything's looking pretty good here. I'm going to move to the Rig tab here, and you can see that on the Rig tab, this controls how the character is set up for animation. Now, in most cases for humanoid characters, that is characters with 2 arms, 2 legs and a head and a torso of course, then you want to make sure that the animation type specified for that character is humanoid. Any other values and you're going to get yourself into a world of hurt and headache, and you really don't want to go there, I'm quite sure. So make sure that you choose humanoid. So I'm going to bring this character into the level just by dragging and dropping. And immediately you can see that I've dragged and dropped the character into the level, but he's massive. I mean, he is a giant. What I'm seeing here are his feet. If I zoom out, you can see, wow, we have an enormous character. Now I'm going to shrink the character down. There are different ways to do this. I could select the Cyborg Character right here in the hierarchy panel, then move to the transform component and adjust the scale. What we see inside the scale field are effectively normalized values. So 1 means the default import size, and if I were to put 0.5, that would mean the character should appear at half the size. And if I were to put the number 2, for example, and I really wouldn't do that in this case, then the character would appear twice as large. But I'm not going to change the scale there, because you may remember from the very first movie in this series, I recommended that whenever you can avoid it, you simply don't adjust the scale value. Instead, I'm going to move down to the project panel and select the Cyborg asset here and move back to the Model tab. You'll see that at the top of the Model tab, we have a value here that says Scale Factor. This is a kind of default uniform scale that we can apply to this character mesh at source, not inside the scene, but applied to the character mesh file itself. I'm going to go to the Scale Factor here, and I'm going to change this to 0. And maybe 0.5. And let's see how that works, and choose Apply. And you can see here that actually he's still pretty big. I'm going to change this again to 0.02 perhaps and choose Apply and see what we have here. I'm going to reposition the character to the world origin and see how he looks inside the scene here. And I think that is a pretty reasonable size. How is he going to look if I move that to a 3? So again, pretty large. I'm going to keep him at the size right now of 0.03. I may come back later and tweak that by making him slightly smaller, maybe 0.025, or I may even go back to 0.02. But right now I'm going to stick with the scale factor of 0.03. And really what matters here is whether you think the character is about the right height for this environment. And when looking over this here, I think this is pretty good. If I move the character, for example, just underneath the light source, you can see he's still not tall enough to reach that light source. So that's an indication that, yeah, maybe this character is roughly right for this environment. But of course, right now he's actually facing the wrong way. But I'm glad to see that when you select this character, you'll see that his pivot point is down here by his feet. And this blue arrow that's pointing forwards, that's the forward vector. That should always be pointing in the direction that the character's looking, in the same direction as the character's nose, and that is exactly the case that we have here. So that's looking pretty good. Now the next thing I want to do is, right now you'll notice this character is standing in a T pose. That's a neutral default pose. You can see the character is standing here, his 2 legs together, but his arms stretched out on either side. Now if I were to press play on the toolbar to play this game, this character is simply going to remain standing in that idle position. If I switch in fact to the game tab, you'll see that actually our game camera isn't aligned to the world geometry at all. And I want to do that now to get a good view of the player character. So I'm going to switch to the scene tab and position my 3D view. Well, I'm going to position it about here for now. Actually, what I can do is move and drag and drop the Game tab side by side here with the Scene tab. Find my game camera, which actually is all the way over here. I'm going to bring that into the scene. You can already see as I move the game camera, you can see inside the Game tab the effect this is having. So I'm going to bring this up into the environment, pretty much further back, maybe over here. Grab the Cyborg character and move the character in this direction here. Now he's facing away from the camera, and that's pretty much okay, but for the moment I'm going to rotate him to turn to face the camera so that I've got a good view here of the cyborg. I'm going to set him to about there. Now if I were to press play on the toolbar here, really not much is going to happen. We're going to enter play mode as we would expect to be able to preview the game, but the character is still standing in the T-pose. I want to apply an animation to our character. I want this character to be continually running along. So to do that, I'm going to move to our animation folder. That is return back to the project panel. I'm going to move to the Cyborg folder and the animations folder, where we have a list of different animations that we can simply apply to the character here. Now the animation I'm particularly interested in, at least right now, is the run animation. Now when I select the run animation, we don't actually see anything here inside the preview panel, but if I switch to the animation tab here, we can get a better view of what's going on. In fact, we have this really weird distorted animation that you can see here, and that doesn't look too good at all, but this animation is going to work. I don't know why right now that is not working as intended. But in any case, I'm going to expand the run field here to see run. In fact, when I select run in isolation here, we get a much better preview here inside the object inspector. And there he is, and that's looking much, much better. So what I'm going to do is move over to the character here, the Cyborg character, and I'm going to drag and drop the run animation onto the Cyborg character. And it seemed to have rejected that. Let me just try that again. And actually, it's worked this time. I know it's worked because when I select the character and I take a look at the Animator Component, you can see that it's populated the controller field, and we're going to see that shortly. But I'm going to press play on the toolbar, and when I do this, the character will spring into his run animation, and you can see there the character is now running, and that's looking pretty good. You can see that this is running exactly as we would have expected. And really applying this animation to the character was simply a case of dragging and dropping the animation. Of course, there's a lot more to it than simply dragging and dropping, as we are going to see shortly. But this is a way in which we can drag and drop an initial animation onto the character and preview that pretty quickly. Okay, so we've now configured our character to run. Now we're creating an infinite runner game, but I don't just want our character to run despite the name of the genre. In fact, I want our character to transition between two different animations: idle, that is standing still, and running. And the reason for that is when the game begins, I don't want the character to just burst into a sprint, running along the corridor, and then the player is left to figure out what to do. That's pretty bad usability. Instead, I want to begin with the character standing idle, and when the player clicks the mouse, then the player is going to start running through the level. Now, to create this setup, it's more complex than just playing one animation, which is the run animation. We have to set up what is called an animator graph here inside Unity. And it's really simple to do this, but it's not obvious how you access it. And I'm going to show you every step of the way. So I'm going to start by selecting our Cyborg character here inside the hierarchy panel to view his properties in the object inspector. You'll see that the character has an animator component. This component defines how the animations on this character should be blended together. You'll see that we have a controller field. This refers to an animation controller, and this effectively is the graph that defines how animations should play. Now, if I left click once on that field, Unity will automatically select the animation controller where it has created that inside our project and inside our hierarchy. but this still doesn't allow us to view the contents of this animation graph. To do that, I just need to double click on that asset, and I can do it both from the project panel here, or I can select the Cyborg asset and double click on it here. I'm going to double click it here. Now, when I do that, Unity will automatically display the graph for me inside the Animator window. Depending on your layout of your interface, the animation window may appear here, it may appear as a free floating window, it may appear docked over here, but all that really matters is that you can view this somewhere in the viewport. I'm going to rearrange my tabs here in the interface so that my game tab and scene tab, they appear together and I can get more screen real estate. And I'm going to move my animator graph into here so I can see the whole thing. In short, the way this works is the green node is what fires when the level begins, and then Unity will trace the connection from the entry node to the next item, which is the animation that's being played. So in this case, when the game begins, the entry node is activated, it follows this connection to the run node, and that is why the run animation plays on the Cyborg character. If I move down here to the animations folder inside the project panel, and I expand the idle animation and drag and drop that into the graph instead, you'll see that what we end up getting here is an entry node connecting to the run node, and then we have this kind of free floating idle node. Now what this means is that when the game begins, it's going to move from entry to run, the run animation will play as expected, and idle, although it exists in the graph, it's not going to play because it's not connected to anything. So I'm going to, in fact, this time right click and choose Set as Layer Default State. This means that now the entry node is connected to the idle node, and it's actually the run animation that's not going to play at all. Let's confirm this by moving back to the Game tab, pressing play on the toolbar, and seeing the effect that has. And here you can see the player character is in fact standing in an idle position. But this time, the run animation doesn't happen. How can we set up this graph so that the player begins in the idle animation, and then when we click the mouse, he's going to transition to the run animation? Well, we're going to set up half of that configuration now and half later, and we'll see which part we can do now. I'm going to stop playback and go back to the animator graph. I'm going to move the idle animation to the left-hand side, and I'm going to build a connection between idle and run, because effectively the player begins in idle, and at some point when we click the mouse, we want to change to run. I'm going to right click on idle, choose make transition, and then using my mouse I can choose what this connection is listed to here. So I'm going to move over run, left click, and that establishes the connection between idle and run here. So if we were to play the game now, what would happen is the entry node would fire, it would move to the idle node here and play the idle animation through once, and then when that was completed, it would move to the run node. But I don't really want that. I want the player character to continually loop in idle until we tell it to change. Now we can tell an animation to change from one animation to another by using parameters. And the way we access those here inside the animator window is we move to the parameters section. I'm going to select parameters here. Now the parameter list is empty, and the reason for that is because our animation graph begins completely empty of parameters. Parameters are just flags or values that we can set to trigger animations to change. In this case, I'm going to create what's called a trigger parameter because I want to trigger a change between one animation and another. To do that, I move up here to the plus icon, I left click on that with my mouse, and I move down to the very bottom option that says trigger to create a trigger parameter. Now it asks me to name that parameter, and you can really name this anything you want so long as it's meaningful. It's very important to cultivate the habit of naming things meaningfully. Now in this case, when the game begins, the player character is going to begin in idle, and effectively when we click the mouse, that starts the action. So I'm going to call this parameter start game and press enter on the keyboard to accept that name. Now I'm going to go back to the connection between idle and run, and when I select that, or when I left click on that connection here inside the animator, I can see here on the object inspector that we have a series of conditions. these are the conditions that tell Unity when one animation should change to the other. In the conditions right now, it's completely empty. All I have to do is click the plus icon to add a new condition, and effectively I want to say when a check mark is placed inside the start game parameter, then the player is going to start running. The next thing we have here inside this connection here is where we have the connection between idle and run. We have this option in the has exit time field to choose whether the run animation plays immediately or whether we should wait for idle to finish before playing. Basically, whenever we choose the start game field, I want to play the run animation immediately. So I want to deactivate the checkbox that says has exit time. And that now has configured our graph completely. Now I'm going to put the animator side by side with the game tab. So I'm going to drag and drop that so these are now side by side. Actually, I am not able to drag this. I can now. Great. Excellent. I'm going to switch back to the animator so that I can view the start game checkbox here in the animator window. I'm going to press the play button here to play the animation, and I can view this character here standing in an idle position. Notice you can see here even a visualization of that animation playing on a loop. Now I'm going to move over to the start game checkbox and activate that checkbox. And the moment I do that, notice now that the character transitions from standing idle to running. That is exactly what I want to happen. Now, of course, the player isn't going to be hanging around this checkbox and pressing the start game. That is only here for my visualization and to configure this graph to run as we want it to. In a later video in this series, we're going to be creating a script file using the C# programming language to activate that tick box when the player clicks the mouse. Great, we've now configured this graph to work as intended. I'm going to switch the run node here to be back to the default. We can always switch it back later when we need to. I'm going to make the run node the default so that I get a better visualization of the character, because the next thing that I want to do is, although this character is running, he is running on the spot. That is really not what I want. I want this character to offset and to move forwards in the scene while he is running. I want his run animation to play, but while he's running, he should actually be moving forwards in the scene, and that's what we're going to be looking at next. So next up, let's make the character run forwards. I'm just going to reconfigure the tabs here in the editor so that I can go back to the scene tab. We have our player character standing here. Now he's facing the camera, and it's about time now where we need to change that. So I'm going to select the cyborg again and set his rotation back to 0 here. Now we have this character that rotates, and that's all working pretty well. I don't really want to disturb this configuration here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a completely new and empty object, just as we did when we created the prefabs. And I'm going to make this effectively the same location as the player character. So the player character is standing at this location here. I can easily copy these positional values by clicking on this cog icon, and the menu appears outside of the recording window, but there is an option that says copy component. I'm going to select that option and go back to this empty object, and then I'm going to click on the cog icon here and choose paste component values to effectively duplicate the values, placing the empty object at exactly the same location. I'm going to name this object player root, and I'm going to grab the cyborg object and simply make it a child of the player root. The reason I'm doing this is because the cyborg object has plenty of animation being played on it. It has the idle animation, the walk animation, and this can make changes to the transform component and adjust the orientation and the position of the character. I don't really want to disrupt anything that the animation is doing. Instead, the movement of the player character through the scene that I'm going to be adding to the player character, I want to add that to this player root object so that while the animation is playing, the root object can be moving forwards through space, making this character run through the scene. So effectively, when I press the play button on the toolbar, I know that the character, the player character, is going to be continually running. If I switch back to the scene tab, you can see the player is running here, and effectively I want this object, the root object, to be continually moving forwards to create this idea that the player is being offset through space. Now we could create our own script file to do that, but here's an interesting thing. Did you know that Unity actually gives us a script file that can move objects forwards automatically for us? It's not immediately available here inside the Unity engine, but we can get easy access to it. Now, for example, if I select the player character and I choose the component menu here, under the scripts field, right now there's a whole range of different scripts that we can add to objects to do things for us. Now, the moving script is not part of this collection, but we can add it to it. It's part of the Unity Standard Assets package, which we can get from the Unity Asset Store. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to jump over to the Asset Store tab, and I'm going to search for Standard Assets. I'm literally going to type here, Standard Assets, and then press search. Now, right at the very top, the very first option available is exactly the one I want. It's created by Unity Technologies, and it contains a variety of different assets that we can simply drag and drop into our Unity projects to get a ton of stuff done. I'm going to select the Standard Assets package. Now, this is a pretty large package. It's 182.7 megabytes, and it contains a lot of stuff. I really don't need the vast majority of it. So this time when I click download and then import, and it provides me with the asset package import dialog, I don't want to import everything. I want to be selective about this. So Unity goes ahead and it decompresses the package. Eventually, when it's kind of figured everything out, it's going to present me with the import package dialog. I'm going to start by marking everything to none. That is, nothing is selected initially. There are two things that I want to import. I'm going to be folding up these assets here. Now, there are quite a few options to choose from, but the number of things that I actually want to import is actually very limited. So I want to import the utility package. This contains the scripts files that I need. But I can't just import the utility package, and there's a very simple reason for that. The utility package depends on this part of the asset here, the cross-platform input controller, so I need to import that too. If I imported the utility package without the cross-platform input, I would get an error. So if you've made that mistake, it's not a problem. You can just re-import the standard assets package and import the cross-platform input controller in a completely separate step. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to import both together. So I'm going to select these two and then choose import. Unity will go ahead and again process these assets and then finally import them into my project. Now, when the asset import is being completed, you're going to get a range of different folders added down here to the project panel. I'm going to make sure that the console is cleared of any warnings or errors so that I can take a look at the assets that have been imported. Now, the assets that have just been imported have been included as part of the standard assets folder. Here inside the project panel, you can see the cross-platform input controller as well as the utility folder, but I'm not actually going to access the assets in that way. Instead, I'm going to select the player root object, and now when I choose component and I choose scripts, we get more options available all of a sudden, and these different options that have been added are part of the standard assets package that we've just imported. What we can do through this menu is we can attach different components to the player object to change the way it behaves. Because remember, when we look at all of these different game objects, they only differ by the number of different components they have. A game object is simply a collection of components. When I select the main camera, for example, you can see it has a transform component, a camera component, and an audio listener component. If I select this root game object here, the corridor, it just has the transform component. The only thing that makes diversity among the objects is just the fact that they have different components. So I'm going to select the player root here, and I'm going to add a component to it. I can do that by clicking either the Add Component button, or just make sure the object is selected and choose Component, and then choose Scripts, Utility, and the script that I want is the Auto Move and Rotate script. That will allow me to move an object continuously through the scene. I'm going to select Auto Move and Rotate, and when I do this, you can see under the Move Units per Second, I can expand that field and provide the speed for the player character. Now when I select the player character inside the scene, you can see that the forward axis is the blue axis. That is the forward vector, and that is also called the local Z axis. When I move to the move units per second, I can specify the speed for the character by specifying these units per second here on the Z axis. So I'm just simply going to type the value of 6 to specify an initial speed of 6, and I think that's probably right. I can easily preview this here by simply pressing play on the toolbar. And there we have it. If I go to the scene tab, you can see the player is continually running along at a speed of 6. That is 6 meters per second the player is moving forward. Notice he's continued moving right out of the tunnel, continuing into empty space. And actually, he's not going to stop running. He's not going to stop there. He's just going to keep moving and moving and moving. Notice there's no gravity applied or anything like that. He's just continually moving in space, and that's totally fine. Now, of course, this is an infinite runner, and really the world cannot really be infinite. We don't have an infinite capacity on our computer. And in terms of the capacity of a Unity scene, that is not infinite either. That means that to create our infinite runner, we actually have to use some tricks. And there are different tricks and different ways of trying to create the illusion of infinity. Effectively, what we need to do in the case of this game is we're going to wait until the player gets to a particular position, about here, for example, and then we're going to teleport the player all the way back here so that he continues running again until he gets to here, and teleport the player back, and so on. Now we're going to create an excess of these tunnels going into the distance for some distance far away, so that the player won't actually perceive the moment when he moves from here and is teleported back to here. This is a bit of clever trickery that we're going to need to apply, but we're going to be doing that in the next movie of this series. At this stage, we have successfully configured our player character. He can stand idle, he can run, and he can actually move through the scene by being offset. In the next movie, we're actually going to make our infinite runner infinite by actually making this player loop around, hopefully imperceptibly. I hope you found this video helpful. This has been BeIndie.biz and I've been Alan Thorn. Please do check out our YouTube channel and subscribe to keep notified about updates to this series. In the next movie in this series, we're going to make our infinite runner, well, infinite. Stay tuned.